Chapter 4 The Taxon. The mortal sweetest feeling humans ever had, Sayward reckoned, were for your own young ones. Only you had to be a mammy before you found it out. Once on a time she thought she knew just how a mammy felt toward little tykes a-hangin' to her skirt. Hadn't she raised Sully and Wyatt, you might say? Hadn't they run to her for every piddling thing? And Asha and Jenny too. Maybe they had, but she knew better now than think she was their mam. You could feel mighty close to a sister or brother, but it wasn't the same as your own. No, you found it was something different when you and your man's own flesh and blood came along, a new body no bigger than a minute, helpless to do a tap for itself, looking to you for rations and for waiting on, hand and foot, till it was big enough to fend for itself. Didn't she know? Wasn't this her first girl child, sleeping in the cradle, and her 3 boys rolling and fighting on the new punchin' floor, and all different? Resolve, you could tell, would make a speech-maker like his pappy. Since the cradle he had the gift of gab. As a babe he used to talk to himself, chirping and pulling, gurgling and crowing to keep himself company. Now Gurdon was close-mouthed. As her uncle, he was named after back along the Conestoga. Seldom a whimper came from him, but you never could fool him any. Sneak up to his cradle, light-footed as you please. Those little bent ears heard you comin', and when you got there, those bright black eyes saw you first. Number 3 boy, when he came along, had his own tricks. He would kick and throw himself till that red cherry cradle would jerk on its rollers like he was rockin' himself, and that wasn't all that Tom Thumb could do. When he reckoned she didn't let the milk down fast enough, he used to butt his head against her tit like a greedy gray moose calf standing spread-legged and with neck outstretched under its mammy. Oh, those 3 boys of hers were a caution, pinching, gouging, squabbling, one trying to get ahead of the other all the time, but it hadn't anything they wouldn't do for their mite of a sister sleeping in the cradle now. Truth to tell, those 4 young ones had fetched some of the blessings of up yonder down to her and Porteus's cabin, here in the endless woods of the Ohio. That's what Sayward liked, humans around. Her own couldn't raise too much noise for her, save when she had company. She couldn't make out how some women whined to hear a babe cry. What did you expect of a small babe? Crying was the one thing it could do. Besides, it was a pleasing, natural sound in a cabin. Yes, she took after her mam. She didn't know what she'd do if she was barren like Miss Covenhoven and Jenny, with a house fallow as a field that had no crop a-growin'. Well, tonight the Wheelers would have plenty company, for Porteus had asked folks to come see about their taxing. This being Old Christmas, it had some dark days in the year. Black Friday, when the Lord was massacred, the first Monday in April they called Cain's birthday, and the last day in December, when Judas Iscariot hanged himself. But Old Christmas was bright as a new penny. It waited till the middle of the long winter, when paths were snowed in, and folks seldom stirred from their cabins, when the sun hardly rose out of the forest, and the blood halfways froze, so that it went through the heart sluggish as slush. Then old Christmas came along to thaw out the veins for the Christ babe, and to make a promise of shorter nights, for longer days were already a-starting. Jake Tench and Will Beagle were the first to come, except Matthias Cottle, who was there since noon. After Jake came Zephin Brown and Squire Chew, with Captain Butt, the old Indian fighter. It was good to see the whole grist of McWhirters coming in, stamping off the white curds and fleeces. "A punchin' floor by Hokey Day," said Granny McWhirter, whom they fetched on a hand sled. "Next thing you'll be wantin', Saird, is a bed off the floor." "Man alive, it's cold," Squire Chew said, his face and ears like a turkey cock. "Snow drifted so deep it dipped in my pockets. I wished it was gunpowder," Captain Butt said. "What would you 'a' done, Cap?" That's what the old Indian fighter was waiting for. His eyes lighted with the fire men like him had when they laughed. "I'd 'a' touched it off and jumped down a well. We seed painter tracks, Zephin. Jude McWhirter plagued him. He was snuffin' your way. Better watch out on the way home. Take off your things, everybody," Sayward called. "I'm waitin' till I thaw out," Jude said. "You won't get nothin' here to thaw out with," Jake Tench told him. "Why, these folks spend all they have for something to eat, and never have a drop of liquor in the house." "I don't want nothin'," Ellen McWhirter said. "I'm just glad to be in the warm." She went on to tell Sayward how cold it was out her way. Her milk had ice on it in the pail. Hugh McFall had his tongue froze to his gun hammer for licking the flint. He had to go to Billy Harbison's cabin to thaw himself loose. Their run was ice clean up to the spring. That was the first year they ever saw spring water freeze over, and the Withers twins had nigh bled to death a-fighting with icicle swords. Sayward went around busy, taking their wraps and piling them high on pegs. Oh, it might be a hard winter, and an icy wind outside, but it couldn't get through these stout logs and chinking tonight. Here in the cabin was like summer. She and Porteous had made a special fire this afternoon. First they had dragged in a heavy log on a hand sled. This they rolled in the fireplace, far as it would go for a back log. Then a forestick was laid on the fire dogs, another on top of these two, and the fire built up in front with split wood. It took till this evening for the fire to reach its full strength and seemliness. Now with a little replacing it would last all night and some days afterwards. When one log burned through the middle, they would just drag the two pieces out to the hearth and split them for top dressing. The Covenhovens and Jenny being the nearest. Were almost the last to show up. Sayward's eyes warmed as she saw her sister. Of all their family, Jenny, Wyatt, and her were the only ones left around any more. Another Christmas, she doubted if they'd see Wyatt. She was glad enough for this night, with the cabin full as Noah's Ark. The babes were laid in a row up in one corner of the loft, and the older young ones sent up after. They took along the white door stone and the hammer to crack hickory nuts and black and white walnuts. The loft boards thumped, and small skiffs of dust kept drifting down. Smoke rose from clay pipes and curled here and yon around the cabin. That smoke would float calm as a river till it met some hole in the chinking. Then it would run in rifles. Oh, they didn't talk taxing yet. That could wait. They hadn't seen each other for a while. The night ought to bile with sociableness first. Friendly talk and chatter rose between those four walls, like the cabin was a nuggin of warm grog, and you could sip it till morning. Jake Tench kept riding Matthias Cottle, asking him riddles and catch questions. Never could Matthias give the right answer, but always had he an excuse for being wrong. I was just a-thinkin', he'd fend himself. If I hadn't been a-thinkin', I wouldn't a-thought that way. Sayward guessed she would never hear the last of that. From now on, if ever she was wrong, Porteous would rally her that she was just a-thinking, and if she hadn't been a-thinking, she wouldn't have thought that way. Porteous was a master hand at deviling. He was standing by Jake and Matthias now, his eyes green with relish. She could tell he was cooking up something. "I want to ask you a very personal question, Matthias," he said, and his face was grave as a gravestone. "Is it true you had ancestors?" "It's a lie," Matthias called out, bristling. "I never did, nor my boy either. His head's clean as yourn." "Well, they say that you slumber in your sleep," Porteous plagued him. "It's false as a gypsy," Matthias shouted. "I never once did, not since I was little anyway. That's the way it went. Not till after they had meat, Johnny Cake, and Dittany did they get down to taxing." Porteous told of his trip to Maytown. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "as you know, we are getting up in the world. Our township was formed last month, and is to be known as Washington. I'll bound it for you." He took out a paper beginning at a point on east bank of the river. Section 18, Township 2, 14th Range, north along the river, in all its meanderings. He read on till he came back again to the beginning. "Buckman Toll is constable, and Zephon Brown tax collector. Buckman had asked us to make out a list to send down to the assessors, and I want you all to lend an ear and a willing hand." It was more than an hour that the men had their heads together by the fire. Once in a while they would ask the women if they knew what kind of a house so-and-so had, or how many acres. In the end, Porteous read off the list, so any who knew could tell if he made a mistake or missed anything. "Residents and proprietors of Washington Township." His voice sounded like a judge reading off a list of court sentences. "Noah Andrews, Scutched Log House, 93 acres. Will Beagle, Cabin and Shed. Chancey Barker, Hewed Log House, 113 acres. Joel Butler, Round Log Cabin, 110 acres. Zephon Brown, Hewed Log House, 2-story log barn, 208 acres. Cabin, 91 acres, Old Harbison Place, Thomas Carter, chipped log house, 90 acres. Pewter Chew, hewed log house and barn, 70 acres. Isaac Chapman, log house, spring house and barn, 125 acres. Glass Cochran, round log house and barn, 144 acres. Matthias Cottle, cabin and stable, 86 acres. John Covenhoven, hewed log house, barn and spring house, 164 acres. Henry Giddings, chipped cabin, 42 acres. Amsa Goodrich, chipped log house and cabin stable, 91 acres. Abel Goshorn, log house and mill, 12 acres. Linus Greer, hewed log house and kitchen, 46 acres. Scoville Harris, chipped log cabin. William Harbison, cabin, 28 acres. Norton Ingram, hewed log house, 120 acres. Patrick Keller, double log cabin, 112 acres. Hugh McFall, log house and barn, 169 acres. Judah McWhirter, hewed log house, cabin and barn, 195 acres. Alex McLeod, log house, red log stable, 67 acres. Azira Penny, round log cabin, 56 acres. Luke Peters, cabin and barn, 87.5 acres. George Roebuck, log store and house, 4 acres. Nicholas Ramsey, shell of a scutched log house, 72 acres. Andrew Stackhouse, cabin. Franklin Steffi, cabin, 18 acres. Jacob Tench, cabin. Buckman Toll, hewed log house and barn, 180 acres. Michael Topping, round log house and barn, 117 acres. Porteous Wheeler, log cabin, 147 acres. Adam Withers, cabin, 21 acres. Theodore Wilder, hewed log house and shed, 129 acres. Sayward gave no notice she minded when Porteous read off his own name as proprietor of their place. Everybody knew it was her land, and that nobody gave out a woman's name as owner unless her man was dead. You don't have Louis Scurra's place down, Porteous, Jake Tench said. I don't look for him to come back. His place is still ours. It should be Jenny's place, Sayward said stoutly. If she wants to pay tax on it, Zephin put in. Oh, I'll pay what tax I have to keep it, Jenny declared with spirit, but I didn't come here tonight to be taxed. Not on Old Christmas. Porteous cleared his throat, and everybody looked at him, for that was a sign he would take care of this. Jenny, I thought you were a church-goer, and knew your Bible. He rebuked mildly. I want to remind you what the Gospel according to St. Luke has to say about taxing at the Christmas season. His eyes had a bit of the old Harry in them, and his voice came out sonorously as he leaned back and without book or prompting gave from memory as good as a preacher. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and all went to be taxed, every one to his own city. And Joseph also went up to Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, her days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for him in the inn. It seemed mighty quiet in the cabin. Most of them looked at each other, as to say, now wasn't that just like Porteous, an unbeliever, and yet he knows more about the Bible than meeting folks. Granny McWhirter had got so deaf of late she could hardly catch a word, but she knew the gospel when it was spoken. She sat there watching Porteous's lips and nodding. Her face was a quilted patchwork of wrinkles. "This is the real day our Lord was born in," she said, "not New Christmas, like some want to make out." "How do you know?" Jake rallied her. "That was a long ways back." "Oh, I want our—" Granny bobbed her head quickly. "But that's what Preacher Kindler always said. He ought to know. He claimed a good person couldn't die on Old Christmas. I've watched since, and I never knowed any to. Born, yes, but not die. One time the Monsees had Preacher Kindler tied to a stake. He wa'n't a preacher then. It was the night before Old Christmas and bitter cold. They never looked to find him alive next mornin', but he was good as ever. At 12 o'clock midnight, Old Christmas mornin', he said, a wind came up from the south and thawed him out. It stayed warm all Christmas Day." "Didn't stay warm today," Jake Tench pointed out. "I can tell you what our pappy told us once, Jake," Jenny called out with spirit. "He never seen it before or since. He caught a coon Christmas mornin'. When he got to his trap, that coon was down on his knees. He didn't know if it was the way the trap had his foot or what, but he was a-kneelin' in the snow on Old Christmas. It went mighty hard to kill him, he said. I can tell ye a story of Old Christmas," Captain Butt offered mildly. "It was the way that coon had his paws cotched in the trap," Jake Tench told Jenny. "Let the captain tell his story, Jake," Sayward called. The old Indian hunter looked at her pleased. He had a fine face. He knew the woods like an Indian, and in a trade, they said, you could cheat him 10 times over, and he was just as easy to fool the last time as the first. You just naturally had to like him. He looked so gentle and accommodating, with his soft gray eyes, but Jake said, when he got roused up, those eyes could look at you to make your blood curdle. I don't mind what year it was any more he started out, but I was just a little tyke. They was 3 of us, all boys, and our ma'am made us each a suit of blue jean stuff. We was proud as Lucifer, and Old Christmas we took the path to our nearest neighbor to show ourselves off. My oldest brother was in the lead. Halfways over through the woods, he gave a yell. He seed Injuns a-comin'. "Legs for it," he called. "Every dog for hisself." He started runnin' back through the brush. We run too. I always heard how Injuns throwed down their guns and pulled their tomahawks once they started after. Looking back through the brush, I reckoned I could see them comin' and hear them whoopin'. My middle brother and me stuck together. I seed him pull at his necktie to open it so he could get more wind. But we hadn't gone fur till I heard him gaspin'. When I looked, he was staggerin' and soon went down. "I'm done for," he made out to tell me. "You go on. Tell ma'am they got me." I was sure a tommyhawk hit him, for I didn't hear no shot. I turned him over and still couldn't find blood, but I seed where his necktie was pulled tighter in a gallows noose. He was so worked up, he'd pulled it the wrong way. I out with my knife and cut him loose. He come to right off. Up he jumped and beat me home, but our pap couldn't find any sign of Injuns, so I got whooped for slashin' that necktie." Over her head, Sayward had a glimpse of Resolve's face. He was lyin' at the loft hole listenin'. Oh, he was a serious little body. He had no time for play games or nut cracking when the talk was good. "You saved a good many from the Injuns, Cap'n?" Miss Covenhoven asked. "I never kep' account," he said modestly. "I just tried to forget it, like they do." "But they appreciate it," Jenny fetched out. "Do they?" The Indian hunter gravely scratched his chin. "I seed one last year. He was just a little feller when I first knowed 'em. The Delawares took him and his sister. They lived in the Ohio bottom on the Virginny side. Their ma'am was a good Christian woman, and I was bound I'd get them back to her. Well, I must have followed 2 weeks waitin' for my chance. One camp I worked in that close I could nigh on to touch them when an old Injun had to get up durin' the night. He stood in the dark and never seed me layin' or behind the log. It felt just like warm water out of a tea kettle poured on me. That was the hardest I was ever put to lay still. But it paid me. Before daylight I got those young ones off. I had to kill 5 or 6 of the bunch, but I got those 2 chillun back to their ma'am with no more than scratches on them. Last year I seed the boy for the first time since. I wouldn't have knowed him. A farmer rolled a barrel of cider in at Major Calloway's, where I was stayin'. The major told the farmer, 'You know this man settin' are? It's Captain Butt that took you from the Injuns.' The farmer never said a word. He heard 'em all right, but he just kept rollin' that barrel and lookin' at me over it. Then he went back to his team and drove off. Now, I don't mean he was ungrateful. It was just a long time ago, and likely he forgot. Sayward liked that old man. He had more things happen to him than you could shake a stick at. He was mild as milk. He could sit by the fire quiet as a bump on a log, or kick spry as a squirrel when it came to jigs, and 2 or 3 handed reels. Now, what could the matter be with Resolve? Sayward wondered. He looked anxious, like he didn't feel hearty. She felt his forehead, and it was hot against her hand. She made him drink penny-royal tea, but that only made him worse. He couldn't stand still any more. He had to fidget around, so painful. Minute by minute, his little face looked more desperate. She would put him to bed, for he looked like he was coming down with the fever. But he cried out like a soul in fire that he wouldn't. He was in mortal torment. That's what he was. When Aunt Jenny plagued him, what was the matter? He only moaned. It was mighty late when she saw his little face screw up with the first hope it had tonight. Captain Butt had left his chimney corner and was wrapping himself up on the way to the door. Little Resolve tiptoed over to him. "Can I go long out?" he piped. The old Indian fighter looked down at him. He understood right off, you could tell. "You needn't be afraid. I'll look after you," he said. Then the big one and the little one went out the door together. Sayward had to laugh to herself. Now wasn't she the big fool? It was a joke on her. Why, Resolve wasn't any more ailing than she was. He was only tormented. That's what he was. He had to go out so bad, but all those Indian stories had scared him of the dark. She had made him drink all that extra tea, too. Wasn't he the proper little body to hold it that good and himself so straight? Why, his back teeth must have been floating, and he was too ashamed to tell in front of everybody. When he came in, he was changed, like night to day. He could jump and bounce. His face shone. Now wasn't she thick-witted not to have figured it out? Raising 3 boys would learn her plenty she never knew before. She would be able to walk with Solomon till she got through. Chapter 5. The Face at the Window. If it had a brighter child in these woods than her Sully, Sayward did not know who it was. It wasn't that she was her mammy. Sayward would rather her child be a little slower like the rest. It didn't do a young one good to be made such a fuss over. It might go to her head and give her the notion she was better than others. Sooner have her look up to her older brothers and sisters, if she had any, and for the younger ones to take her down to earth once in a while. Now her boys never could get the best of Sully. She might be littler, but she was too bright for them. Sayward wouldn't tell Porteous the strange token she had before Sully came along in this world. Resolve was only a little feller then, a mite bigger than Sully was now. Worth's oiled paper window was knocked out long ago, and Porteous had a real glass light from George Roebuck's. The bound boy had mortared it in the hull. Porteous would sit by that window light with his books and lawyer papers, but this was in the night time. Porteous was off somewhere, Gordon asleep and Kinsey in the cradle. Resolve was a-laying on the old bear skin, making a cabin of corn cobs in front of the fire, while Sayward knitted at the thumb of a red mitten. It came to her Resolve was mighty quiet. When she turned her head, he was looking at the window, and his eyes were stiff in their sockets. "Somebody a-peekin' in," he said. She looked, but the window was empty. "It's went," Resolve said. "I'm afraid." Sayward felt no fright. She went to the door, aiming to look outside. When she opened it, Put the Hound came in stretchin' and yawnin'. "You just reckoned you seen somethin'," Sayward told him, comin' back. "Oh no, I seen him plain," Resolve said. "Who did you see?" Sayward asked him. "A little boy." The first queer feeling ran up Sayward's spine. "Now I know you didn't see anything," she said. "What would you be afraid of a little boy for? Besides, no such would be out in the woods tonight, and if he was, he couldn't reach his head up to that winder." "It was a little dark boy," Resolve said without winking. Sayward laid down the mitten. This had gone far enough. "You're a-making this up," she said sternly. "No, I ain't. The little dark boy knowed I seen him too. Now harkee, Resolve, I won't have you lyin' to me, or nobody else either." "I ain't a-lyin'. If you seen anything," Sayward said, "I reckon it was the fire shinin' in the winder." He was all dressed in white, Resolve told her. That queer feeling went over Sayward again. "You go back to your playin'," she told him. "You just took it into your head you seen somethin'." "I seen him plain like I do you. So I did." Resolve went back to his corn cobs. Like she said, but more than once when she looked up she saw his eyes raised to the window. Now Sayward wasn't what you call a scare baby. It had no man or woman either in these woods, she would give ground too, but she didn't like Resolve's notion. He saw a little dark boy dressed in white a-peeping in the window, not when she was carrying a young one, and she didn't like the other token she had the very day before the baby was to show up. Old Lady Giddings had had one foot in the grave too long, and when she died, Sayward told them they could bury her aside of Jerry if they wanted. Some of the men came out to clear the brush so that it would be ready as a burying ground tomorrow. Resolve was out. He came in all worked up. He said his mammy had to go along outside. He said he saw something and he didn't know what it was. When Sayward and he got out, he pointed to a strange dark man tugging at a rock with his back turned. Buckman Toll saw him point. "Don't fret, boy," he said. "It won't do him no good. We'd never put him in here." The dark man gave no notice, he heard, but Porteous, who had a grubbing hoe in his hand, stood up. "Then ban my own body from this spot," he spoke up so all could hear. "Sooner see me laid beside some lowly son of Ham in a remote spot unsanctified by a man than in a place marked by human bigotry and dissension." He looked around him with dignity. "I hope that those within the sound of my voice will be my witnesses, and in the event of my untimely death remind my widow of these sentiments." Oh, there were plenty witnesses, in the sound of his voice, to remind Sayward if the need came. Buckman Toll shut up like a jackknife. Only the strange humble man paid no notice. He seemed like one apart. Sayward watched him struggle up with the rock and tote it off, cradled in his arms and belly. "I seen one of them when I was a gal," she said to Resolve. "I reckon it's Zephon Brown's new hireling." "What's the matter with him?" Resolve asked. "They ain't nothing the matter with him. He's a black man." "Why's he black?" "Because God made him so." "But why did God make him so?" "I reckon God wanted a change." "But why did he want a change?" "You can ask your pappy tonight. Maybe he can tell ya." She put him off and went back to the cabin. Ever since Porteous spoke about dying, she had felt the repeated stabs of her babe deep in her being. All through the spells of pain that night, Sayward kept her mind off any notion of signs or tokens. Oh, it had things in this world, if you believed them, that were darker and more fearsome than hell itself. It had babes born to decent girls, she'd heard, that were monstrous as toads, hairy as wild bulls, or mad as a wolf, with slobber on its jaws. When the hard labor was over, the first thing she asked about was her baby. "How does it look?" She put to them. "Just fine," Miss Covenhoven said. "Is it dark or fair?" Sayward asked. "Why," Miss Covenhoven said with surprise, looking it over in her hands, "I'd say fair." "It has no dark spots," Sayward persisted. "She hasn't a blemish on her." "It's not a boy, then." Sayward took a good breath. "It's a fine little girl child," Miss Covenhoven declared. "What makes you talk this way, Sayrd?" "I'm just glad it's all right," Sayward said, and shut her eyes with relief. All this was a few years back. That baby grew like a stalk of aunt's weed. She could say Mammy and Pappy at 8 months, and bobble from stool to stool at 9. At 10 months she came big as you please down over the door log where Sayward was talking to Granny McWhirter and said, "Howdy, howdy." Now she was 2 years pushing on 3, and knew more letters than her mammy did. Oh, she was bright and sharp as a needle. She picked up everything she heard, and plenty she didn't. She might be the littlest except for the new baby, but she was always one step ahead of the rest with her Yankee tricks. Today Sayward was out boiling soap, and you'd think Sully was the one making it. She lugged water in her little kettle, spilling half of it over herself. She made Sayward bend down so she could stick a bunch of sweet fern in her mammy's hair against the wood flies. She was always the one to do anything first. She stood big as you please on the stump, stirring the kettle with the sassafras paddle, plaguing her mammy with questions. She wouldn't give Sayward any rest. She'd pop a new question before you could muster up an answer to the old one. And when she wore out her mammy's tongue, she'd make the answers herself. She was going to have her own ash barrel. She would pour in water, and out would come lye. It would be lye strong as whiskey. Only white hickory ashes would she put in the barrel, and only coon fat in the kettle, for soap made from coon fat never smarted the face like her mammy's soap and Aunt Jenny's. No, her soap would be soft as butter. With it you could wash a silken towel. Oh, Sully was a pest if there ever was one. She could talk you deaf and dumb if you'd let her. When the others hollered for their turn with the paddle, Sully threw it down and swept hard on the ground with her little hickory broom. Then she toddled around in a circle and stopped stock still on one foot with a stupid look on her face. "What you doin'?" Guerdon wanted to know, while Kinsey on the stump tried to look this way and that through the smoke. "I'm a chicken," she called, solemn as all get out, standing on that one foot like she was one of Miss Covenhoven's gypsy fowl. "I'm a-thinkin' how to lay a egg." Guerdon had to try it while Kinsey itched and sweated, wanting to come down and try it too, but before Guerdon had his foot down, Sully had a new trick. She was meandering around with her head bent way down and her eyes looking out back between her fat, far-apart legs. "What's that now?" Kinsey wanted to know. "I got the rheumatiz," she called. "I can see how the world looks upside down. The kettle's a-fallin', and you're a-standin' on your head in the sky." Kinsey couldn't stand that. He dropped the paddle and jumped from the stump to see the world downside up. In 2 shakes, Sully had scrambled up to stir with the paddle while Kinsey cried she stole it from him, and little bitty Sully stood up there and sang at the top of her voice, "Liar, liar, hangin' on the briar, with your britches on fire." Oh, she was too quick and bright for her brothers. They fought and screeched to high heaven, but it didn't hurt the soap any. When Sayward got it done, the soap was clean and yaller as jelly. Sayward still had time to grind meal for supper and to visit in the cabin with Mary Harbison, who came along the trace with her little girl. Solemnly, she could hear the 4 young ones running outside, yelling to each other, a-playing Injun against the Black Hornets, who reckoned the run belonged to the Hornet Nation. Then for a while it was quiet as a sitting hen. Sayward inside picked up her ears, fighting and bawling she paid small heed to, but peace and quiet sometimes called for looking into. That fire under the big kettle, she told herself, should be out this long time. Even so, the youngsters had strict orders to stay away. She had no idea that this minute Resolve was running halfway to the cabin hard as he could come. Not that Resolve was a tattletale. He just wanted to tell his mammy that Sully was playing with those ashes. She was showing off to Salome. That's what she was. She'd swept them out from under the big kettle with her little hickory broom. Now she was a-running through with her bare feet, to show she wa'n't afraid. But Resolve never got more than halfway to the cabin. He must have stopped dead when he heard Sully screech. Sayward heard it plain enough, a high screech, sharp and mad like the edge of a scalping knife. It lifted Sayward off her stool like God Almighty had yanked her. When she got to the door, her eye took in Resolve, Gordon, Kinsey, and Salome, all standing at different places, stiff as small steel yards, staring at the ball of fire running for its mammy. Not till then did Sayward get through her head that the ball of fire was Sully. It was only a shake and a half till Sayward was across that yard, wrapping her skirt around the fire, beating out the flame with her bare hands. But that was a shake and a half too long, for fire is a cruel, tarnal thing, and a little girl child is soft and tender as a young Mary bud coming up in the spring. Sayward wouldn't believe what she saw when she took her skirt away. This was something to make her blood stop and her hair stand. That was something that couldn't be. "Oh, mammy," those blackened little lips of Sully tried to say, a-telling her she meant no harm, a-begging her not to scold that her dress was burned, a-asking her mammy to help her little Sully, who had never asked help from anybody, but always knew her own self what to do. If she got to be 100 years, Sayward told herself, never without her voice breaking could she tell a stranger how it went with their little Sully that day, how she lay in her bed looking up at them with blackened rims where her eyelashes ought to be, how 1 minute she had been in this world light and free, and the next the gates of the other world were open and she had to pass through. Already she was where her own mammy couldn't reach her. She couldn't even touch grease to that scorched young flesh without Sully screamin' so they could hear her over at the Covenhovens. Never did Sayward think she would be weak enough to let other folks get her own child ready for the Berry Hall. She fought cruel as death to do with her own burned hands what had to be done. When the women wouldn't have it, she let them push her in the chimney corner, but it would have been easier to do it herself than watch. They tried too pretty, but they only darkened that little burned face and body that were once white as milk. They tried to fix the gold hair that Sayward used to run her haw comb through, but was now like a lump of burned weeds. The worst was to sit and listen while they dragged in their young ones to show what would happen to them if they played with fire. All the time in her mind she could see that little body when she first started to walk. Back and forwards Sully's small red dress used to go, her little red arms out to balance. She'd never get a-weary. She could go it all day, wraggling and wriggling, skipping and jumping, going hoppity-hoppity, nodding and bobbing in and out, from one side to another. Did that little mite know, she wondered? Did something tell her she had only a short while in this world? And that's why she was always on the go, making up for it, cutting one ditto after another. The women in the chimney corner, kept up their women talked, Cam, Sayward. They said a woman couldn't expect to raise all her young ones. It was a blessing Sully was spared the trial of going through this vale of tears. She was too bright to grow up anyway. The Lord took such for his own. Oh, Sayward never said back a word, but she would have changed places in a shake with Sully, if only Sully could go through this vale of tears, and in her heart she cried her disbelief that the Lord would steal human flesh from his children. No, you couldn't throw the blame on the Lord. She didn't hold too hard against herself, either for not harping more about staying away from fire. She had done it a-plenty. You couldn't ding-dong at young ones all the time. You had to let them be their own selves once in a while, or they'd grow up tied to their mam's apron strings. But if she'd had her wits about her, she would have taken a bucket of water and doused that fire good before she came in the cabin. She might have reckoned that Sully would be up to one of her Yankee tricks. She felt hard for Porteous when he came. He looked like he had slept with a hex. He had been way out at Keller's Improvement when he heard the news. He didn't carry on any more than she did, but she knew how he felt, for little Sully was his favorite right, and now she'd never climb his knee again, or call out the letters of the alphabet, but spend her days a-mouldering in the ground till nobody could tell any more which dust belonged to her and which to the woods. The only comfort Sayward had was that they had cleared a burying place for misgivings and those that came after. Now Sully could lay out of the dark, of the trees and the sun. She wouldn't have to lay alone either. She would be next to her grandmam. Both she and Jerry had always been the sociable kind. Jerry had come to these lonesome parts against her will. If she'd had her way, she'd have lived her life in the settlements. Her mother would feel kindly tonight, Sayward thought, if she knew she wasn't lying in the woods any more, and that she had kin for company. The hardest thing was to look at your young one the last time by the open grave. Once they put the lid on that box, you would never lay eyes on her again. She lay so uncommon still for Sully, wrapped in her muslin winding sheet. The bound boy had stayed up most the night to make this small box of sawn boards for her. He had made it fine as a town box, shaped like a diamond, the widest place at the shoulders. He had taken some shavings and pegged a scrap of muslin over for a pillow. 4 young boys had carried the box out of the cabin to the grave. Now wasn't it a pity that Sully couldn't have made a nicer-looking corpse, and yet you might. No, Sully would not be as other folks. Even in the way she had to die, she'd go her own way. She wouldn't waste away or die from the flux or a fever. No, she had to be a ball of fire, and die from swallowing some of the flame. Sayward never knew how long she stood there, bitter and cruel, looking down for the last time. She held her youngest, Huldah, in her arms, so in after years that babe could say she had looked on her sister in her grave box. Porteous and the boys came close after. Gordon and Kinsey said no word, but resolve stiffened when he looked in the box. He stood like he saw a ghost. "Ma'am," he said, pulling at her skirt. "Ma'am, it's all right," Sayward told him. "I want to tell you something. Ma'am, do you know who that is?" "It's our poor little Sully," Sayward said quiet as she could to calm him. "No, it ain't, ma'am," he told her, starting to sputter. "It's just that she went through the fire," Sayward told him. "No, it ain't, ma'am." Resolve stood his ground. "I knowed our Sully, and I know this one. Don't you mind the one I told you about that time?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Sayward reproved him in a low voice, trying to get him still, but he wouldn't listen. "I'd know that one anywheres," he cried the louder. "That's the little dark boy I seen that time a peekin' at me and you through the winder." Chapter 6. His own man. Most every day, Wyatt told himself, he'd never make a farmer. He plumb hated the looks of a reap hook or flax swingle. You could tell he hadn't been born between two plow handles, for never did his hands get the hang of cradling or pulling tits at milking. No, he took after his pappy. If it hadn't been for his sister Sayward, he'd never kept at it. When he wasn't helping her clear land, he was hiring out to John Covenhoven or Buckman Toll. He wished he had a penny for every gavel of grain he bound or hill of corn he planted. And what good did it do? Squirrel and other vermin reckoned you hid grain in the ground just to dare them could they find it and dig it out. When corn was in the ear, coon and foxes stole it, deer spoiled grain and clover patches. A rail fence didn't stop them any. Hugh McFall ringed a field with stumps he'd dug out. Women and young ones passing at nightfall claimed those monsters were a fearful sight to see, laying there on their sides with their gaunt roots sticking way up yonder, enough to scare you out of your wits. But that fence kept out no deer. They sailed over easy as pigeons. And yet do you reckon Sayward wanted him to quit Covenhoven's and Buckman Toll, and put in his time tracking down game and varmints? No, she had even fought his getting his new rifle. What he made was his to trade like he pleased, she said, but he had one rifle already. What did he want another for? Oh, Wyatt learned to keep his mouth shut to her about anything that had to do with guns or game. He never breathed a word about the monster hunt till the night before it was to happen. Then he reckoned he ought to tell her he was taking tomorrow off. He took the sporting rifle down from the horns over the mantel. That ought to be a hint, he thought. He put the ramrod in the barrel. You hear about the big hunt they're a-havin', Saird. Don't that make you feel good? I ain't thought much about it, his sister said. He looked up. Why, they're a-doin' it for you and everybody else that has a patch of corn or head of stock. They aim to stop all this stealin' and spoilin' that's goin' on. They're bound they'll clean all the vermin and varmints out of these woods. I'm not partial to folks trying to hog it all, Sayward said gravely. You don't care about farmers, Wyatt cried. You don't give a hate about what stock they lose. Why, painters are sneakin' right up to their barns. Bars are taking shots out of pens. The Yankee up on Skull Crick lost 10 sheep one night. Tonight, dogs alone. He ought to watch his sheep at night. Then he wouldn't lose them, Sayward said calmly. Don't you care about young girls? Wyatt demanded. Up by the English lakes, the night dogs chased one on horseback. The horse throwed her and wouldn't let her back on. She had to walk in a ring in the snow around that horse all night. When daylight come, she swoonded. I heard about her, Sayward said with brief pity. But any night dogs you shot around here wouldn't help much up her way. It would help around here, Wyatt declared. Last week they hollered so loud in the daytime, Buckman couldn't make out what I said. I don't reckon he missed much, Sayward said, lightly, going about her business. Her brother just shut his mouth and looked at her. You could never get the best of Sayward. First thing he knew, she'd claim it would be better for the country if the men had logging bees instead of big hunts. The woods, the trees, she'd say that's what was holding back the country. Once they cleaned out these forests, the vermin and varmints would go of themselves, for they would have no place to stay. Oh, he knew what she was after. She didn't want him a hunter like his pappy, wandering here and yonder where it pleased him. No, she wanted him to steady down and to be a farmer like Slow John Covenhoven, or survey with a compass and chain like Buckman Toll. Once she said she didn't want to see any woman have to traipse through the wilderness after Wyatt like she and all of them had to do after their pappy. But if she figured she could break him, she had another thing a-comin'. Oh, he wouldn't let on to her one more lick about the big hunt, if he could help it. Let her reckon he was a-going to work at the Covenhovens tomorrow. Let Big John think so too, if he wanted. When Sayward turned her back, he took his rifle out to his shanty. That fancy rifle was the nighest thing to his heart, a close twin to the sporting rifle of Louis Scurra. It was of curly maple, striped the short way, like a tiger, with a brass butt and box in the stock for tallow and patches. He kept it in the cabin, for it was safer there, and it didn't get so damp as the shanty. Then fine folks who visited Porteous and Sayward could see it too. He kept that rifle clean as a whistle, but now he sat down and worked it over from front sight to butt plate. The pan and frizzen he scraped with his knife till the pure metal shone through. He swabbed and polished the barrel like it was hammered out of gold guineas. When he couldn't find more to do, he laid it by his pallet. To him it was fine as a gamecock, and closer than a brother. That night he didn't need anybody to wake him. His eyes hardly shut. Long before daylight he got up, dressed. It was mighty cold. The cabin stood dark when he got outside. The skiff of snow on the ground felt hard as iron. He told Put to shut his big mouth and keep quiet. The hound was crazy to go. They started through the still and wintry night. Woods. It was at Billy Harbison's where the men from down this way had said to meet. That was a sight to come out of the woods and see the blood-red fires with all the men sitting around on logs and saw blocks, for Billy's cabin wouldn't start to hold them all. Their hounds made the place ring with music. Put went right in with his head up and his tail high and wary, but Wyatt stayed on the edge, for it wasn't seemly for a young fellow to push it too far. It was enough to stand there holding his rifle and drinking it all in. The sight of so many hunters, their firearms sticking out this way and that, their powder horns hanging full. And their shot pouches heavy, went to his head like whiskey. Oxen couldn't have drug him away, so long as the men laid around those dogs growled and bristled at each other. But once their masters stood up to go, all was forgotten between the hounds. They raised on their hind legs and bounced in the air, all the time tonguing together, till Michael Topping said they blowed like a horn band. From now on, all would be cake and pie between them. It was still dark. Wyatt could hardly tell the brown spots from the white on Put's waving tail, and hardly could he believe all this passel of hunters. They must have come from 20 miles. He knew folks from the old states were coming into these parts, but never did he figure they could muster up a company like this. About as many more were meeting up the river to beat down. Half of those here had no rifles, only muskets and scatter guns. Those without firelocks carried hay forks and axes. Some had a bayonet or butcher knife mounted on a pole, and that was the only weapon they had. Boys without firearms led the hounds on buckskin thongs. All looked with respect on Wyatt and his rifle. Never had he felt he was his own man like today. Once out in the deep woods, Buckman Toll and Billy Harbison, the captains, stood Wyatt at his place in line. That line ran way out yonder, every man an easy hollering distance from his neighbor, and now the password came along, carried from man to man. The line began to move forward. Those who had horns or conch shells blew them. Brush was shaken and beaten. Hounds bawled. Back and forward you could hear men calling to each other, so they could keep the line straight and drive the game ahead. Oh, those deep stentorian voices of men in the deep woods, coming from a long ways off. How they rang, full of lusty vigor, drifting with the forest air, echoing in the glades and swampy places. Hardly a word could you make out, yet they stirred the blood with the strange mystery and excitement of what they said. All morning Wyatt breathed the free air of the chase. This, he told himself, was the only life he gave a height for. He was out of the prison house now. Hardly did he recollect, at times, who he was or where he had lived before now. He thrashed through teeming thickets and pleasing hazel bush patches. Now and then he would come out in the great reaches of the deep woods, where he could see the hunter on either side of him, slipping with his rifle among the butts. He tramped down a slough of hollows. He climbed between fern-topped rocks and mossy logs, strewn thick as the flotsam of some ancient forest sea. His feet broke through the thin ice of swamps and slipped on the side hills where the hickories and gray squirrels throve. Most of the time he was among big butts that shot up 30 and 40 feet without a branch. Sometimes he could catch sight of some gray, black, or tawny back far ahead, dodging into the brown winter mist of the woods. Mostly it was too far to waste powder on, but already 4 tumbled squirrels lay soft, warm, and bloody inside his hunting shirt. Guns were beginning to crack harder along the line now. You could hear musketry dead ahead, too, and away to the east and west. The lines were coming together, it sounded like, and Wyatt's blood started to pump. Could all those gray, black, and tawny backs soon be fenced in on 4 sides now? He was getting mighty close to the spot they all headed for. Wyatt knew the place good, and on the banks of the sinks he stopped like they told him. Here the ground dropped away, for the swampy landmark that ran a half-mile long and a few hundred yards across. He could hear hunters firing on the far side, and at both ends too. It must be the bars were nearly closed around their game, and varmint pasture now. He could make out deer in the sinks, running this way and that, trying to break through the lines of men at one place or another. Wyatt saw a doe, then a spike buck, then an old stag with great horns, laid back and parting the bushes as he ran. Twice he sighted his rifle, only to see other game closer. He didn't know which to draw a bead on. His hands started to shake and tremble. It was all coming in one pile. But his ague didn't last long. He had no time for buck fever. Once he let the hammer go and started ramming in fresh powder and ball, he had to get all he could before some others pulled them down. He only had to be careful not to shoot high, or he might get a man on the other side. When the fire slackened, word came from the captains to let the hounds loose. You didn't have to sick them in. They knew their own selves where to go. They popped right into those slinks like frogs in a pond. Then most every bush and thicket started to give out what hid in them. Oh, that wild pasture was a bedlam of black, gray, and tawny backs now, racing this way and that, churning and thrashing. Bear, wolves, panther, and deer tried to get out, first on one side, then on the other. You could hardly hear anything but a solid roar of musketry. A black powder fog settled over those sinks, like at Sinclair's massacre. Wyatt had never heard of anything like this. The rank smell of the smoke, the death struggles of game and varmint, and when the shooting let up for a lick, the bawling of dogs and wild, fierce yells of the men were sweet as music to his senses. This, he told himself, was the sixth wonder of the world. He wouldn't trade places with anybody, no, not even with his pappy, shooting and skinning wild bulls on the Mississippi prairie. It was late afternoon till the fire gave up. The sinks lay quiet at last, only the stirring of a bush or crack of a twig told that some game still hid in there. The captains hand-picked the carefulest men to go down by themselves and finish up the slaughter. When the last rifle cracked, all hands joined in to drag the game in piles. When they got through, Zephyr Brown mounted a log to call the tally. They had 19 wolves, he told them, 21 bear, 3 panther, and 297 deer. The coon, fox, squirrel, and turkeys, he said, they did not trouble to tally. Now hunters crowded around to tell whoever would listen how many they had shot, how far the ball had to travel, and how close to the heart it had struck. Some claimed they had stabbed deer with hay forks when they tried to jump over. One told how he had chopped down a bear with his axe. Oh, if you believed every man there, the count would have had no end to it. With a gray moose or two, which some call the woods horse or elk, Now if any man had seen a gray moose today, it must have got away, for there was none among the slain, but it had humans that could have been tallied in the bag. Some were only powder burned, or winged in a fleshy part, but one had been taken home grave hurt, and another lay over yonder groaning. Wyatt stood there proud, his rifle barrel still warm in his hands. He was drunk. That's what he was, drunk on blood and gunpowder. But he didn't stand long. When they started scalping wolves, he leaned his rifle quick by a tree and set at one of the night dogs with his knife. He would take a back seat with nobody skinning a pelt. He squat on his hunkers and was still at it, bloody and pleased when the sleds came. Hardly had the horses stopped till the men made a rush, knocked in the heads of the casks and those with cups, horns, or bottles dipped in. Wyatt took his place at the casks, for he was in his 20s and his own man now. They had made out to camp here for the night and go home next morning. Already men were setting up lean-tos, barbecuing bear and venison. All was done in lively feeling. This was no work, but a frolic. When the casks were dry, they made high jack, grabbing bear fat where it got soft over the fires, and running after their neighbors. Every man and boy was greased till his face shone. Liveliest and most pleased were the farmers, for those bear and night dogs would raid no more stock pens. The settlers hollered and capered and cut up monkey shines, till the dogs snuck off, fearing they would be next on the list. Hardly any man closed an eye that night. After butchering and feasting, they laid around hickory fires, telling hunting yarns till daylight. Wyatt sat still as a trapper, a-listening to tales of the black moose and wild bulls, the tiger cat, the striped deer, and big horns. Now and then he looked around him in the firelit woods. He wished Sayward could look in here tonight. He'd like to see her bamboozled face when she laid eyes on this grove of trees, a-hangin' every place ye saw, with dressed deer and bear, and what would she make of that pile of varmint carcasses and waste parts? A mountain of flesh, that's what it was. It would outlast the snow, the men said. When next June came around, it would still be here, festering and rotting so you could wind it a mile off. But he wouldn't be here to smell it. How could he go back to plowing and milking and breaking his back over stumps after this? Never could he do it. Sooner would he crawl in some hole and give up and die. He took after his pappy. His pappy used to have the cabin and all the big butts around, drying with skins. Once he ran down a gray moose and fetched it home with a halter, but Jerry wouldn't let him keep it, sooner than spend the livelong day with a grubbing hoe. His pappy would have hanged hisself to a weeping pin-oak tree. His pappy had Munsey blood, and so did he. He could feel right now the wilderness calling, the deep woods out yonder, the prairies and mountains to the westward. They ran in his blood and scented his nose till he didn't know any more if he was in the body or somewheres out of the land of the living. No, never could he go back to corn hoeing after today. Those black moose they told about, and the hairy and naked wild bulls over the big river. He would have to see them and trail them and get them in his sights. Likewise the tiger cat, the striped prairie deer that outran the wind, and the big horns that some called mountain rams. Andy Stackhouse was asking tonight who would go with him. He was setting out tomorrow toward the setting sun. Well, Wyatt would set out with him. He would send home his share of today's meat with Billy Harbison. He would pick up his traps from his line and go, but never would he stop in at Sayward's, for if he did, he might stay. They were a-telling more tales now, and Wyatt stopped his thinking to hearken, for never would he miss a story. These were mostly ones he hadn't heard before. It had men here who claimed they had seen Captain Brady with their own eyes, General and Lady Washington, the Gerty brothers, and Tom Fawcett, who shot the red coat, General Braddock, in the back. But the story he listened to closest was about a girl in the old state. Regina Hartman was her name, and she was took by the Indians and growed up with them. Colonel Bouquet set her free with a passel of others. Her man didn't know which was her, and she didn't know her own ma'am. But her ma'am sang an old Dutch meeting-house catch, and that made her run to her ma'am, for she still minded it, and that minded Wyatt of Little Sully, not Sayward Sully, but his sister took by the Indians, and never hide nor hair heard of again. Oh, never would he go back to Sayward and Porteous now, and yet he hated running off without saying something. Sayward had raised him, you might say. He had fought her plenty and called her names, but most times it turned out she was right. Maybe she was right that those who followed the woods never amounted to much. A farmer could stay in one place and gather plunder, she claimed, but a hunter had to keep following game. He seldom ever owned a horse to carry him, and his women folk had to take Shank's mare. Didn't he know? Hadn't his own ma'am and all of her young ones had traps after their pappy with their plunder on their backs? Oh, he knowed all right. He knowed she was right. He had knowed it a long time. He had tried to break hisself of it. He'd knock the wildness out of him, he said, if it was the last thing he did. He had done his dangest to kill the ever-hunter in him, but it wouldn't stay killed. It was his Monsey blood. He reckoned it would never say die. He only wished he had dropped some word before he left that would stand for giving good-bye at the cabin. He might have played a little with his nephews and niece last night, for he was a full uncle to every one. He might have made up talk they thought was in fun. Then, when he didn't come home, they would know it had been real. They would know where he was and think of him when he was away. They were harder to leave than his full sister, for he took to them, and they to him. Especially he took to Resolve. Now that Tyke was different from his Uncle Wyatt, as daylight to night-time, for a little feller he was, steady as could be. He could even read and write where Wyatt couldn't sign his own name. He was his uncle's favorite. Wyatt wished he had asked him to write something on a piece of paper so he could take it with him. Then some time he sat alone at night in some far woods or prairie, he could take out that paper. It would make him see resolve plain as if standing here, screwing up his mouth and making pot hooks and curlicues with his goose-feather pen, while around him his smaller brothers watched and admired